Hello and welcome to Time of Death. I'm your host, Dee.
And I'm your other host, Ris.
Host, Riz. Do you know what someone said?
I got that Riz.
Rizzed. Tonight we are going to be exploring the darkest corners of crime, healthcare, and psychology.
Wait, what were you saying? Were you saying someone told you I had Riz?
No, someone was said, how the heck do you... Sometimes you guys sound like I don't know who is talking. So I'm Dee.
And I'm Ris, but there's still not going to be differentiate our voices. We just announce ourselves before we say anything.
Hello, I'm Dee, and I'm responding to Riz.
If you're new here, welcome. We are two nurses that love talking true crime. We like to focus on cases that have a heavy medical influence to them, or cases that feature a medical professional as a perpetrator or a victim.
But tonight we're going to be really diving into something that has shaken the medical community at its core very recently. So the case tonight is the shocking and devastating shooting that happened at UPMC Memorial Hospital in Pennsylvania, where a former police officer, Diogenes Archangel Ortiz, opened fire on staff members, going on to kill one officer and injuring several other people. This isn't just a case about violence. It's much more insidious and complex than that. It really is tragedy, which rooted in trauma, which happens frequently, as well as mental health struggles coming into play and systemic failures on the part of the healthcare system as a whole. So tonight we'll really dig deep into the details of the incident, explore the potential psychological factors as well, which I think is also so important, and as usual be solution focused and discuss how something like this could be prevented in the future. And again, as usual, we do want to warn our listeners that there are some graphic details in this case, so if you're not in the headspace for that, we'll see you next week. This is a new ongoing case in which the opinions that we have are based on the research that we've done and information that's available to us. So again, this case is ongoing, so nothing absolutely definitive at this point. So on the morning of February 22nd, 2025, Diogenes Archangel Ortiz, a 49-year-old former police officer, walked into UPMC Memorial Hospital in New York, Pennsylvania, carrying an assault rifle. Archangel Ortiz reported having a deep-seated grievance with the healthcare system as a whole. His attack really did seem to be fueled by rage and grief. A family member had recently passed away in UPMC's medical intensive care unit. And that was the fire, or the gasoline on the fire, that really fueled his actions. There was a lot of rage, grief, processing what had happened, and he placed the blame entirely on the hospital staff for his family member's outcome. Security footage shows him walking very calmly into the building, and he was very composed, very confident. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, he opened fire on hospital staff and officers in a very chaotic and terrifying scene. Tragically, one officer, Officer Mark Lewis, who was a security officer at the hospital, was killed in the attack. He was only 30 years old. Several staff members, including nurses and doctors, were injured, and some of them were injured critically. The hospital was placed on lockdown until law enforcement arrived and apprehended Archangel Ortiz. It kind of all came out after the shooting that Archangel Ortiz had a very troubled history with the hospital. He himself had been a patient there after experiencing trauma and grief due to the loss of the family member that passed away in the ICU. Archangel Ortiz was known to have expressed anger and frustration about the care that his loved one received. I know this is something a lot of healthcare workers have encountered, where family members are upset, oftentimes rightfully so, about the care that their family members received. So this really hit home in that, a dissatisfied or disgruntled family member could do something like this. This is a scenario I think everyone in healthcare has encountered. So this was like especially troubling for that reason as well. There was a significant emotional buildup combined with his background as a police officer. This really was the perfect storm in that he was very isolated, felt like he wasn't being heard, and he was incredibly angry. Archangel Ortiz may have seen his former role as someone who enforces order. As a police officer, he could have really felt that this was his job to kind of take this on and tackle it. And with this conflict and perceiving a failure as a whole on the hospital's part, this could have contributed to him having these very violent thoughts. Mm-hmm. So the shooting altogether lasted about 5 minutes, but it really has left a trail of devastation. Hospital staff, who, keep in mind, have already been working under extreme pressure between COVID, staffing issues, administration breathing down our necks, JACO, it's a very stressful environment as a whole. Critical care is tough. And then something like this happening, it's absolutely devastating. Now, already on top of the normal, quote, normal amounts of stress that they're having to deal with this unimaginable situation and kind of shoulder that emotional toll that this event has caused, which I think has forever changed their lives. So what we can speculate about Archangel Ortiz in terms of motive is mostly based on his background. Grief, anger, loss of control are like the major themes in his life at this point. He was very vulnerable even before losing the family member, and I think this death is really what just pushed him over the edge. When combined with the personal grievances with the hospital, this is what these emotions were really allowed to fester, and there was a violent outburst at the end of it. So, reading all of these articles, my thought was, what could really drive someone like Archangel Ortiz, who had experience in law enforcement, to commit such a heinous act? So, to me, what this looks like is a mix of unresolved trauma and a very clear need for some kind of control. If he blamed the hospital for his loss, which he did, his brain could have fixated on the hospital and, more importantly, the staff as the source of all of his pain. Any pain that he may have had in other circumstances, this was the perfect way to project all of that anger onto the people that in his mind had done something so wrong and awful. This need for control, especially after a major loss like a family member, is often a trigger for violent actions. And this is called reactive violence. Violence which is triggered by overwhelming emotions and arguably could be potentially exacerbated by an underlying PTSD, depression, or even anxiety. Trauma really has a profound impact on the brain in that it can distort perception and significantly impact decision-making for individuals. So, Archangel Ortiz, feeling very powerless after the loss of his loved one, could have kind of reclaimed his power by doing this attack. So it really is tragic in itself, not only what he did, but how unchecked emotional and mental health issues can turn into something so catastrophic. Yeah. In Archangel Ortiz's case, his law enforcement background may have given him the tools and mindset to feel entitled in him acting very violently. Now, it's not all, not every police officer that would be in this scenario would react the way that he did. But, they do undergo extensive training, and they're taught that use of force is something they have to be comfortable with. And, if that's an acceptable solution to problems, it's not a huge leap to believe that violence can solve everything. So, and again, I want to stress that I do believe that there were other factors as well. I'm no means saying that any police officer would react the way that this individual reacted, but I do think that needs to be kind of figured into the equation of why. So trauma, especially the loss of a loved one, it triggers a fight or flight response. Some people withdraw, some people will lash out, and the longer that trauma festers, the more destructive a reaction can be. The idea of something so personal turning into violence is chilling, right? Like, even talking about this, it's chilling and it's disturbing. But in some ways, it does make sense when we think about how individuals process grief. For Archangel Ortiz, the hospital represented not just the place of his family member's death, but it's literally an embodiment of all of the failures that he's had in his life. And this would cause him to feel almost consumed by feelings of betrayal and resentment towards the institution, and more importantly, the staff. And when you're already emotionally vulnerable, it's very easy for those feelings to escalate, right? Especially if we don't have a healthy outlet, which it doesn't sound like he did. So people often talk about the tipping point, where it's the straw that broke the camel's back, it's too much, and someone snaps. So Archangel Ortiz did reach that point where the weight of his emotions triggered something that maybe he couldn't control in that moment, or didn't have the tools to control. And we can't ignore the psychological toll that law enforcement takes on a person. As his background as a police officer, that's an important factor, not only in the almost ease in the training and use of force, but also they're at higher risk for PTSD, depression, anxiety as a whole. And there's a pressure to maintain composure, to suppress emotions, to constantly deal with traumatic events that happen. And that really does eat away at someone's emotional health. His role as an officer was essentially a double-edged sword. He was used to confronting violence and very comfortable with violence, but he also had to bear the emotional burden of constantly dealing with death and trauma. So oftentimes law enforcement, anyone in law enforcement, really are great at masking their emotions. And they're trained not to show vulnerability. They can't, because oftentimes that can get them killed. So essentially they're forced to bottle up everything until it just erupts. And finding himself in a very vulnerable position, he did not have, again, the emotional tools to process this in a healthy way. Instead, it likely triggered his past trauma, whether personally, from his job as a police officer, and that is when he made that decision to act violently.
That's such a good analysis of your breakdown of what you imagine that this man was going through that led him to this point.
Thanks, Ris. So, in terms of what actually happened, there have been very limited public statements from victims and witnesses regarding the shooting that day. Again, the incident resulted in the death of Officer Andrew Duarte, and also the gunman himself, Diogenes Archangel Ortiz, and several other people are left injured. According to what information is available, Archangel Ortiz entered the hospital's ICU with a handgun and zip ties, taking several staff members hostage and going on to shoot 3 individuals: a doctor, a nurse, and a custodian. Thankfully, everyone survived, but they were critically injured, along with multiple police officers. Witnesses have gone on to describe the scene as chaotic, terrifying. For example, one nurse recounted during the incident, she heard gunshots, saw staff and patients running who were screaming in panic, and she and other staff members went on to barricade themselves in the staff lounge and trying to contact authorities and just really trying to understand what was happening. With these actions, the usual safety and sanctuary of the hospital were shattered. You know, hospitals are supposed to be places of healing, but in that moment, it was a war zone. The trauma of this experience will stay with the victims and the other hospital staff for the rest of their lives. Just 5 minutes. That's how long it was.
Wow.
And that's the heart-wrenching part of this. The hospital staff were already under a lot of pressure in terms of staffing, COVID, flu season, etc. Again, the pandemic had really pushed a lot of people to their limits, especially in the critical care setting. And now they're dealing with something completely outside of their training, something they never should have had to deal with. Imagine being a nurse on that unit, used to caring for your patients, and suddenly you're having to protect your life in the very place that you're trying to heal other people. And I think it's also so important to address the systemic issues that contributed to this tragedy. Hospital security measures and mental health support for healthcare workers really need to be reevaluated at this point. Archangel Ortiz's actions could have been prevented had there been better systems in place. The lack of proper mental health support for both law enforcement officers and hospital staff has been a long-standing problem. Archangel Ortiz's grievance as a whole went unnoticed by the healthcare system. If he had received the mental health care that he needed earlier, and if the hospital had a system to identify patients who were becoming emotionally unwell, this could have been avoided. Of note, I think it's important to know that prior to this incident, Archangel Ortiz had a history of legal issues, including an order of protection from abuse filed against him in 2016. He also faced charges of harassment and driving with a suspended license. So this is someone who gave out multiple signals that he was not well. And again, that speaks to broader issues in law enforcement as well. Officers are sent out into dangerous situations, and they don't always have access to mental health resources to deal with the psychological trauma that they face. He had been already experiencing mental health struggles, but most likely was not receiving the support that he needed. And as a result, grief and trauma reached a breaking point, and his actions turned into something really catastrophic. We need to start recognizing that the mental health of healthcare workers and law enforcement is just as important as the physical safety of those who they care for. Hospital and police need to invest in proper psychological support programs to prevent tragedies like this one. So, I can tell you that this case really demonstrates a lack of emotional regulation and what the consequences this has, an inability to do this. Archangel Ortiz, from his mental health struggles to violent outburst, is a textbook example of how untreated trauma and grief manifests in very unpredictable and horrible, tragic, awful, awful ways. When someone experiences any deep loss or trauma in any way, and we talk about big T trauma or little t trauma, that'll be my next soapbox. The emotional brain takes over with trauma. And if there's no healthy outlet, the brain cannot process this trauma. That's when you have a whole other host of issues coming in. You have to feel these feelings, as uncomfortable as they are and how much they might suck. In his case, the trauma of losing his family member, again, combined with his past experiences as an officer, was essentially a toxic emotional cocktail. Do you like that? I came up, that was pretty, I love typing that.
That's very nice.
He was very vulnerable, and he entered the hospital trying to regain some kind of control. And he did so in a very evil way. And again, I keep repeating myself, but that's why early intervention is so important. And I also want to acknowledge that it's a vicious freaking circle, because you have police officers having an altercation when the law enforcement officers who came to rescue the hostages and rescue the victims, they had to shoot Archangel Ortiz while he emerged from the ICU holding a hospital staff member at gunpoint with her hands bound. So the officers opened fire, killing him and preventing further loss of life. An autopsy confirmed that he had died from multiple gunshot wounds, and his death was ruled a suicide. But what's so crazy about this case is now you had someone that had trauma and then inflicted trauma onto other people, right? From the victims in the ICU to the patients, the staff members, the hostages, down to the officers that had to engage and kill Archangel Ortiz. So it's just perpetuating this awful circle and cycle of trauma. What is the big lesson here tonight, Ris?
Early intervention.
Early intervention it is. Things can go to SHIT really quick. It can go to hell in a handbasket when mental health is not properly addressed. Law enforcement officers, healthcare workers, the public as a whole, we need to prioritize mental health just as much as physical health. If this was someone that had a broken leg, he would have gotten treatment. But because his brain broke, he got none. It's true. I use that analogy all the time. If you broke your leg, you would get treatment. If you couldn't walk on your leg, you couldn't get treatment. But when you can't function because you're depressed and grieving and sad and angry and hurt, processing all these emotions, you don't have any outlets, you don't get treatment. And that needs to change.
It surely does.
The loss of life in this incident is tragic. And again, the survivors will carry the emotional scars for the rest of their lives. We can only hope that this tragedy sparks the necessary change in both the healthcare system, law enforcement, and the public as a whole to ensure no one else has to experience what happened at UPMC Memorial Hospital. Moving forward, mental health is a priority. It's no longer an option. And it should be a priority for everyone. If we don't address the root causes of trauma and grief, the tragedies are just going to keep pouring in. And as if they didn't sustain enough trauma perpetrated by Archangel Ortiz, the hospital statement was this: "We have received confirmed reports of a gunman at UPMC Memorial and shots fired. The gunman is deceased and no patients have been injured. The hospital is now secure but is on divert. This is a fluid situation. Law enforcement is on the premises and is managing the situation. We're grateful to all the local law enforcement agencies for their quick response." Now, keep in mind, no patients have been injured. But your staff was. But your staff was at the hands of a gunman. But in their official statement, no patients have been injured.
I feel so for the staff that was injured and the hospital as a whole, especially the ICU staff, and also law enforcement for having to, intervene like that, especially on former police officer. That must have been difficult because I'm sure there, on some level, was a sense of camaraderie. Maybe they knew each other at some point. I don't know, but I bet that was difficult as well. Anytime you have to take a life, I'm sure it's extremely difficult.
Good night.
The time, okay, we still have a call it.
I'm all tired. That took a lot out of me. I said, trauma, grief.
My goodness. It's so angsty.
I know. It took a lot of energy out of me.
Now she's ready for bed.
I'm ready for bed. I take a shower and go to sleep.
So the time is 20:06. That is 8:06 p.m. for those of you who do not use military time. And we are out. We'll see you here next week.
Bye.
Bye.